Software engineering is a field that never seems to stop growing. It feels like there's a new front end library that comes out every week, and the concept of DevOps in particular seems to have its foundation rattled every month or so. This begs the question of how are you supposed to keep up? Today's guest is Shane Burkhart, a longtime friend of mine and a coworker from many years ago. Shane's a freelance developer, and today we'll be talking about how we teach ourselves new things. Thanks for joining me today, Shane.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how long you've been doing software related things and what you're currently working on?
So I've been doing software for almost 10 years now, believe it or not. I think back on it, it's hard to even think it's been that long. But 10 years ago, I started teaching myself to code Android apps. And then I worked really hard in my free time to learn everything I could about development and web development, Android development, whatever it was, and worked really hard to get an internship at Yelp, which I then worked at Carfax with Brad. That's how we know each other. And then after that, I worked at a startup called SumoMe. After working a little while at Sumo, I decided that I didn't want to work a job anymore, and I was going to go try to do my own thing and teach people how to code. Actually, it was a company called Spark School. I did that for a while, and then decided to move on to something else, kind of take a marketing approach since I thought that was my weakness at the time, and started doing some marketing consulting, doing whatever consulting I needed to do, and kind of taking it easy, looking for ideas. I've been working on startups plural in the construction industry for the past year or two, and recently been working towards React dev shop of some kind, getting back into my roots and doing some coding again in a more serious professional environment.
That's awesome. I know React resonates really well with me and some of the listeners we have too, so I'm sure they'd be excited to hear more about that.
For sure.
So you mentioned a lot of different technology, and 10 years seems like a large amount of time in the grand scheme of things. But when it comes to technology, it's really not enough for one particular piece, at least.
Yeah.
How do you learn all those things? So you went from Android to web to marketing to back to React. Like, how do you keep up?
Keeping up is the hard part. I feel like I haven't worked at a job for a few years, and so I look at like Hacker News and I see some of the technologies coming out, and it's funny because I feel like I'm getting out of touch, and it's only been a short amount of time, and I'm still in the game. But how do I learn all those things? Basically, jumping in and doing a project. If I don't have a project to do something, uh, to bang my head against. Like, it could be something as simple as just a portfolio website for myself, or maybe a tool that helps me with a hobby, or maybe actual business example. But if I have a project that I can force myself through that uses the technologies that I'm wanting to use, then learning is really easy. It's just a matter of time. So that's really my strategy that I've used up until this point. It's worked really well for me.
One thing that I find really interesting is like it is a matter of time, but there's only so much time in a day.
Yeah.
So how deep do you go on any like given technology? Do you really commit yourself to one or two things at a time while learning, or do you kind of try to spread across the gamut of new technologies or new tools?
While learning, I don't think it's possible to spread it too thin. I feel like if I'm learning, I can only realistically take one or two completely new things on at any given time. Otherwise, you're just going to be stuck in paralysis because you can't get anything to work. It's just the nature of debugging and stuff like that. I think that most of my projects were centered around one piece of technology that I wanted to learn, and then the rest of them were fillers. So, like, I already knew HTML and CSS, but maybe I wanted to learn React at one point, or maybe I wanted to learn iOS, and I already knew how to build backend servers to power it. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. I'm pretty notorious about digging into a lot of really new technology. I have a very academic feeling towards technology, I guess, where I'm constantly wanting to learn new stuff. And I have a friend that asked me what he should use on a project, and I told him what I was using. And he's like, "Okay, cool. I'll learn React and TypeScript and Go and GraphQL." And I'm like, hang on, maybe just." just learn one thing at a time. Like
Yeah.
just do something in React and then add TypeScript and then add other stuff if you want.
Oh, yeah. I think that if it's the only way to go. I mean, if you're gonna all those are awesome things you just mentioned. If anybody wants to learn any of those, they definitely should. But I think that taking all of them on at once, I've definitely been there too, and I think that's how I learned that that wasn't good for me. Is just trying to build exactly what you're talking about. I believe I did a Go app one time with a React front end, and it was just way too much to take on. So I definitely agree that it's just not something that you can take a lot of pieces on at one time.
Yeah, totally. So you said that you thought all those were really good things to learn.
hmm
I'm curious. Do you think there's any technology that like isn't a good thing to learn?
Yeah, PHP, I'd say, unless you're gonna go work at a specific place that does PHP. I'd say like I'd say if you're gonna learn C of some kind, you better go work at a C shop, or just want a general understanding of how programming languages work too. I mean, I did C at one point, but never have written any C professionally. Um, but I'd say that any of the Python, the Rubies, the Golangs, I mean, even some of the languages you're more familiar with, like Elixir, I think has a lot of capacity or capabilities too. But I think like Docker, a necessity. Git, that's definitely a necessity. I think React's pretty much a necessity if you're going to go front end. TypeScript, I feel like, is a necessity at this point with how nice it is and it makes JavaScript sane. I just feel like those technologies that you listed are just really solid technologies that are being adopted by large corporations and have big support behind them.
That's interesting. Your stance seems very practical, which I definitely don't think is a bad thing. And as I've gotten a bit older, I've started to take a more practical approach as well. I used to like really dig into a bunch of I don't want to say esoteric technologies because that really downplays the people and that use them and the communities built around them,
Yeah.
but ones that like there just isn't a huge job market for.
hmm
Like Clojure,
Yeah.
F sharp is a good example, Elm, stuff like that. I still feel like there's a reason to learn them. Like I probably wouldn't write the same quality of code on any language that I write now if I didn't dig into Clojure. Like I learned so much from it.
Absolutely. I think you get a lot of really great ideas from other technologies and things that may not be quite as practical as the things that we talked about a minute ago. But it's not something that you're likely going to use for at like a Facebook, or maybe they have a team or something that does it, but more than likely they're going to be doing something more mainstream. But the values that you get from those languages, because they are so unique, you use word esoteric, but I just it's just very like unique the way that the language works versus another language, and it forces your brain to think a little differently, um, and maybe even bring some of those patterns over that make a little bit more sense for certain applications.
Yeah, I agree with that entirely. So you mentioned you taught yourself web development. You taught yourself JavaScript, React, any of those things. So that was self-directed learning. Is that correct?
Yeah, definitely.
What's your secret to learning on your own? How do you find success there?
So by self-directed, you just mean that I would not have taken a course or would have taken a course?
Uh, I suppose you could have taken a course, but I guess to me self-directed is uh the opposite of me being like, "Hey Shane, I need you to learn React. Here's how you're going to learn it."
I
Like
see.
you took this upon yourself and chose your own path to learn it.
I see. Yeah, yeah. I the beginning of it was just love, honestly. Like I started the first day I learned to code. The first day I wanted to code when I was like 9 to 13. I don't even remember what year, how old I was, but I was told that being a software developer would make you no money. Can you believe that?
I cannot. That blows my mind.
I was told it was going to make me no money, and then I was told that I needed to learn Visual Basic. So my Visual Basic for Dummies book was purchased for me, and needless to say, at 9 to 13 years old, however old I was, I hated it.
Truth be told, I don't know if you can make money in Visual Basic these days, so maybe that's where they were coming from.
It could be. And that might have been what they were thinking, is that this is what I think programming is, so this isn't going to make any money. But regardless, I just wrote it off at that point. I wrote it off for 10 years. And when I was not even 10 years, I guess it would have been more like 8, but when I turned 18, I was going to be a neurosurgeon or a neuroscientist or some doctor of some kind. Not really sure what I was going to do, but I was not going to be a developer. And during my second semester of my senior year of high school, I decided that I needed to make some more money to pay for a college that I wanted to go to that had a medical program that I wanted to be at. And I needed to make some money prior because I didn't have enough scholarships to pay for it. And it was either make money before and pay for it or make money during school. And that did not sound very fun to me. So my strategy was, let's go look at the Android App Store since it's new. And when I went to look at the Android App Store, I looked at the paid apps section, and it was a mess. If you were on the Android App Store at the early days, there was just absolutely garbage of apps. And one of the top apps, is like number 3, was called Roll a Joint. And the app was $2.99, and it had over 1 million downloads. And I was sitting there looking at that, and all you did in this app was grind up some weed and roll it into a joint and smoke it virtually, I guess. And I was looking at that and I'm thinking, that person made $3 million by making this app. Surely I can make something that's going to make some money. So I went to school and talked to my friends about it. And funny enough, they told me that I couldn't do it. I don't even know where this came from. It was like so left field. It made me so mad that somebody, my friend, was going to tell me that I couldn't do it, that I was going to go home and do it. And so I went home and I looked up how to build a Android app and learned after like 30 minutes that it was written in Java. It took me that long to even figure out what language it was. And then downloaded Eclipse and got to it. And, months later, I finally got my first app out. But what's funny is, through this whole time, I was still going to be a doctor. And it was only like a month before I went to college. I'd like already had my admissions, everything. I dropped it and decided I'm going to be a developer the rest of my life because of how much I loved it. I worked like every waking second of my day trying to learn. And that was how much I loved how to code. I mean, I just couldn't get enough.
One thing you said that really stuck out to me there was how you had a friend tell you that you couldn't do it. It just goes to show you that public perception, especially from like a non-developer point of view, is very, very much like this stuff is impossible. It's so
Yeah.
hard to do. Like there are massive companies that build little tiny apps like that.
Yeah.
But that's really not the case. Like you said, you were able to like kind of get in there and get started on Android all on your own with a blog post or a tutorial and
It was actually YouTube videos.
oh, okay, awesome.
I spent 6 months watching YouTube videos of stuff I had no idea what the guy was doing. And he was super annoying to me too. And it was the only thing I had. Like, I knew nothing. There was no other resource really at the time besides just grind. Like, we didn't have Codecademy. We didn't have freecodecamp.org, you know?
Yeah, it was all so new back then that
Yeah.
everyone was focused on building like really gimmicky things instead of like teaching people how
Yeah.
to code or build stuff.
Yeah.
So you said YouTube videos. Do you still use YouTube today, or do you use other like? I guess what type of media do you use when you learn new things?
I think YouTube's really good for certain people. For me, it's a little slow because I've gotten pretty good at skimming stuff. What I mean by that is I've gotten pretty good at figuring out what I need to look at and what I don't need to look at. And I think a video is hard for me to index. Like, I can't go and find that point in that video that I need without watching the entire video. And so nowadays, I'd say that I don't use YouTube that much. I use YouTube for things that may be unrelated to code, but if it's anything related to code, at this point in my career, I just go straight to the docs. Typically, I prefer reading source code, not like source code, but like reading simply what parameters it takes. I've got a pretty good intuition. It took a while to build that intuition. Like, speaking of this intuition, actually, we were talking about these gaps of people that think that it's like a whole impossible world on the other side. But it's funny because anybody that's crossed that gap knows that it's not the case and that it's actually opposite, that everything is easily learnable once you learn some paradigms, some basic paradigms. And those paradigms being conditional statements like if statements and while loops and functions and just basic stuff that's in every programming language and every web app, stuff like that. Once you learn it, it's really easy to do cross transition, but the gap to get there is just so insanely hard that everybody thinks, not even say, I could say insanely hard. It just takes a lot of time, uh, that everybody thinks that it's impossible on the other side.
Yeah, it's really similar to learning another language, like
Yeah.
a spoken language or written language. Once, like we learned English because we naturally had to survive. But like if you try to learn Spanish, it's really hard.
Yeah.
But once you get Spanish down, if you pick up French, I'm not going to say it's not going to be really hard, but it'll be a lot easier than Spanish was because you'll have a lot of those things that you've broken down, like anatomically, like conjugating verbs,
Hmm.
and that stuff will just click a lot quicker. Like
Right.
we just do that naturally in English, but I think it's the same with programming. It's very hard to find languages that don't share like a concept of arrays or lists or
Mhm.
integers and functions, stuff like that.
Absolutely. I think that you just learn what parts are important and what parts are the extra niceties that may be a nice little thing to have in this language, but probably not going to be used very often.
So one thing I don't particularly care for is a lot of Go libraries. Instead of writing like documentation or like out of code documentation
Mhm.
or tutorials, we'll just point you to the Go doc. And I love that Go generates documentation for you for packages just the way it does. It's really fantastic. But I feel like it's really hard to parse some of that stuff for valid examples.
Mhm.
So I'm curious, like, if you run into that, where would you turn? Like, would you look for blog posts or back to YouTube?
No, it would be searches on the internet. I spend a ton of time on Google. It's astronomical how much time I spend on Google. I spend on the actual page of Google, google.com, I spend like a couple hours a day. Um, and that's based on like what are those time tracking apps? I can't even remember the one that I use, but the one that just sits in the background and keeps track of what websites you're on. And I'll have, so many tabs open that the only thing that you see on the tab is the X mark to close it. So that's like, 50 or so tabs at least. And the reason why is because I'm sitting there and making a search. So say I have an error. First thing I do, I copy and paste the message into Google with an extension like Ruby or React or a reference to what I'm doing contextually. Typically, something will come up like Stack Overflow, and maybe somebody at the top will have a question that's similar, but not quite the same or exactly the right question. If it's exactly the right question, it's easy. You go in there, you read it, there may be a link to go read something more, and then you've got your answer. If it's similar question, then you are looking for parallels in your problem to their problem only to get new ideas to try. That's really what I try to do. What it essentially looks like, if I can't go to the docs, like in the Go docs, which you're talking about, I feel like Go is a very seasoned developer type environment. Like the people that made Go intended Go to be used by corporations like Google, where people have some code experience under their belt, and then that's what the infrastructure is created for. And that may be why Go docs are like the way they are, and that's a side effect. But if it wasn't there, and I'm completely new learning Go, then I would definitely look at Stack Overflow. That's going to be something. There are random blogs, like Medium posts, a lot of Medium posts that randomly come up with people giving like how you do this in Go, and banging your head against it. Honestly, there really isn't a lot to some problems or learning in a lot of cases. Like I can tell you that I've spent couple hours before looking for some problem, searching the internet for some problem, one singular problem, pulling your hair out for that problem. At the end of the problem, you realize that it was like a semicolon in an odd spot that was creating a odd syntax situation that was giving you an error message that wasn't quite relevant. And so you were being thrown off the sniff to sniff out what the problem was. And sometimes that's the only way to go about it. Sometimes the only way you can make something work is by simply getting as close to that problem as you can without making the problem happen, and then making the problem happen such that you know what the problem is, and then figuring out from there how to fix it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've been in that scenario so many times where I am just not it's not obvious. And one of the things I do in that scenario is I'll just start commenting out code until it works. And then whenever it works, it's kind of like searching an array of code for the broken piece.
Yeah,
Like now that I know what works, I can invert that and say, okay, this is the block that doesn't work. Now let's go in and uncomment some of that. And if that still doesn't work, then okay, maybe the whole thing's broken, or maybe it's just in that little piece, and seeing where to go from there.
exactly. Can definitely open up so many opportunities for new ideas on what to do. When I see a problem, first thing that pops in my head, I have like 2 or 3 ideas of what the problem could be. Maybe I'll go search the internet, maybe I'll try a few of those ideas. As soon as all those ideas are exhausted and you have no more ideas, the only thing you're left to do is delete some lines that you previously didn't have or did have and run it again. Go back to the last time you do know it was working. If you know it was working there, add one line. Is it working now? Then it was that line. So now you know that that's the problem, and now you can keep, slowly working through it, just like what you were talking about.
Yeah, good debugging is something that I never went through a code boot camp, but I know in college they don't teach you, or at least they didn't teach me, good debugging practices.
Yeah, it's definitely underrated skill in my opinion, but it's probably 80% of what we do.
Yeah, and it translates between languages like with ease. There's very
Oh,
little you
yeah,
have to do to like convert debugging C to debugging JavaScript, for example.
definitely. It comes down to problem solving, really.
Agreed.
Yeah,
Um, have you used any learning systems like Udemy before, or Udacity, or any of those,
I
or I
have.
guess just Teachable, like anyone's Teachable site or anything?
I built a Teachable site. That was Spark School. I've used Teachable. I've used Udemy for machine learning course. And I know some people that used it to learn like Rails right at the beginning. I personally haven't taken very many of those courses online. It goes back to that whole thing of me being my self-paced learner and knowing what I need to learn right now and having to look for it in a whole course. I really think that my learning style makes it so that I have something that I want to do. That's my end goal, and I won't stop until it happens. And it's not like I have to work as hard as possible. It just means that I can't stop because persistence is more important than the effort that I'm putting out in a given minute. Because I could work 5 hours tonight on one problem that's really hard, but my brain might not be 100%. Or I could work 1 hour on it, get it all in my brain, go to sleep, and wake up the next morning and fix it in 30 minutes. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I definitely do. And one of the things I really liked about Clojure, for example, was I felt like when I was problem solving in Clojure, I would spend 30 minutes staring at the code
Yeah.
and then like 1 minute writing 2 lines of code,
Nice.
which sounds super unproductive, but like it's solving very big problems, and that's just a merit to the language and how it works as a whole.
That's cool. I haven't done much with Clojure. I need to try it out.
It's a fun little language for sure. It's if I have to write anything on the JVM, well, Kotlin's a thing now, and Kotlin's fairly nice. But if it was before Kotlin, I would default to Clojure.
The JVM, what a just tried and true uh, piece of technology. I mean, that's one that that's practical. Honestly, I don't know how long. I feel like the JVM, is due for a replacement, but that thing, it's so solid. So many languages built on top of it. So much running on it. It's just a really solid platform.
For any of our listeners that are unaware, the JVM is the Java Virtual Machine. It runs a fair amount of languages at this point by converting them down to JVM bytecode and allows you to write code that runs anywhere.
Yep.
Um, I would also agree with what you said about it being tried and true, but also ready for a replacement.
Uh,
I think that time is coming pretty quickly. If you notice, Scala and Kotlin are really good examples. They're languages that were built for the JVM, but now have very supported native targets as well. So you
okay.
can just circumvent the JVM.
What kind of
Uh,
native targets are they going for?
I couldn't tell you off the top of my head.
Okay.
I'd have to look into that.
Yeah.
But I know that both Kotlin native and Scala native are very big.
Okay.
Clojure can write out to Clojure script. or sorry, to JavaScript called ClojureScript and slightly modified.
We use that at Yelp.
Really?
Yeah, we were one of the head contributors worked there.
That's awesome. I
Yeah,
had no idea.
yeah.
I think we're going to take a quick break and we'll be back in just a moment and we will talk about some of the learning frameworks or guidelines that you follow, what to do when you get stuck, and how to ask for help. Welcome back. Thanks for sticking around through the break. Shane and I just finished talking about his success in self directed learning and the media that he uses while learning these things. So we're going to jump straight into some more questions about how he learns. So I was curious, Shane, do you follow any learning frameworks or guidelines?
Learning frameworks or guidelines? I think the answer to this is yes to some how, but I don't remember what they would be. I feel like I have been on Hacker News enough and probably read a few articles about learning. I read books about habits. I read books about, the way the brain works. I read books about um, just how, like memory palaces, things where you can remember more things, how to remember things. And they're things I just kind of take for granted at this point. Um, but I guess actually one thing that I do think about fairly frequently is how I'm remembering something. So I noticed that a lot of people remember things by remembering the thing. Like if you're in math class and you're remembering something about a mathematical formula, a lot of people choose to write the formula down, stare at it, and or memorize it like it's, you know, night and day. But the truth is that the formula is uh, not always going to be in that form. It is likely to be derived into other forms, and likely the other formulas you're remembering are also derived from some root formula. So in reality, you need like a handful of things to remember to derive the rest of it. So really when I try to learn something, I'm looking for that first principle. I'm looking for that thing that I can learn to remember only that thing, such that when I need to recall the other parts, the pieces that are derived, I just sit there and derive it in like, 30 seconds or whatever it takes to reason about whatever the situation is. And boom, I got it. But all I had to remember was one thing.
Yeah, that's a really good approach. I do something similar, I guess, where I try to break everything down into small, like composable chunks of knowledge.
Hmm.
And then whenever I see a problem, I try to break that down as well and say, okay, what chunks do I already know how to solve and solve those? So it basically reduces like problems, or not necessarily problems, but like things to learn into the smallest possible piece. So you're
Right.
not like stepping on your toes.
I think that's another really good one too, is the divide and conquer strategy, where taking a large complex problem. Oh man, that's actually so good. You're bringing back so many ideas now. So back in the day, I remember there would be situations where I would think of an app or a whole feature, and I would sit here and think, oh, there's so many ways to do it, so many ways to do this, so many ways to do that, and there are 1,000 million ways to do it, whatever. And what would happen is you get overwhelmed. You can't remember it all. You can't remember what you were going to do. Maybe you wrote a plan. Maybe that plan doesn't work anymore. Maybe you don't even know what the scenario is going to look like in 30 days whenever you've written a couple thousand lines of code. But what I found to be extremely useful was thinking about things like a black box. And what I mean by that is whenever whenever you're refining your problems, like you said, into smaller pieces, dividing them into smaller pieces, it's the absolute smallest piece that you can work on. If you can somehow manage to make that, or think about it at least in a black box type scenario, where no matter what the input is and the output is, it doesn't really matter what happened in the middle. That's the black box part of it. It just matters that the input is happening and the output's happening correct. So when I'm thinking about like one particular piece of a problem, like writing a function to do a specific thing, I'm trying to think of that function like a black box in such a way where anytime I need to reference that function, I never need to think about the contents of that function. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it really does. And if you mean function in the literal programming sense,
That way and just like in general scope of problems too.
yeah, functions are they're not supposed to have side effects. They are supposed to be very black boxy. So that's a really good analogy.
It's probably where it came from. First class or first what is it called? First class functions.
Yeah, that would be a term for it. So you're learning something new and it just doesn't click. I assume that happens every now and then. I know it does for me all the time. So how do you ask for help when you reach that point? What does that look like?
I would say things don't click a lot, you know? Like I don't get them on the first try all the time or approaching something completely new. It feels like you don't know anything about it, but you're just piecing together copy and pasted stuff you found on the internet to get it to work right now. And then you're going to figure out, you know, like the inner details of it whenever you start really putting everything together. I feel like that if I run into some problem that I feel like I'm completely stuck on, there's two plans of action for me. Take a break is the first obvious one. I feel like separation from your work um, is so important, and that's something that I would say I learned from writing more than anything. Is that you need some sort of separation from the time that you wrote your draft to the time that you edit it to be able to actually have like a fresh perspective on the situation. And then I'd say that the second solution to problems that I just don't know the answer to is back to the like banging your head against the wall, debugging, and splitting it up into really small pieces just to get it done. You know, I is if you're talking about coding stuff these days, I feel like that most things are not. I don't feel like anything ever gets stuck because my opinion on it is that it's a function of time until I understand it. So there's no way I can get stuck. You know what I mean?
What about like in an example where you don't have enough time to figure it out on your own?
I don't know. I'm freelance, so I have quite a bit of time nowadays. I'd say my shiny object syndrome kicks in before that happens. You know, like if I'm getting super discouraged by something that I either just can't do, I think time away is still so important. Like for instance, there are all kinds of stuff like books. I read a lot of books and about a lot of stuff. And every time I read a book, I can read the same book over and over. I've done it. I've read like How to Win Friends and Influence People over 5 times at least. And I'm quite a few more than that, I'm pretty sure. But every time I read it, it's a different point in my life. And every time I read it, I get something different out of it because I've had separation from it. I've learned other stuff. So let's say you're stuck on something. Something just doesn't make any sense. To me, the best thing to do would be go to work on something different and then come back to it in a month, in a week, in a day, however long you have to just kind of let your subconscious work on it actually. Like for instance, here's an example. I spent 6 months watching YouTube videos. You would have like in that 6 months, you could have asked me anything about coding and I would not have been able to answer a single question. I was just simply writing what the guy was telling me to write and it barely made sense and it was only like variables were hard to understand and like what types were. He says we're learning Java. And so it was just like things that I'd never thought about. And one day I literally woke up and I was like, I think I understand functions now. And it was literally that. And then that day on, it was a black box. Like, oh, this is exactly like you take, you know, some parameters and it returns a value. Every single one of these do this. Boom.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So it sounds like you probably retain your learnings better if you solve them yourself and like conquer them on your own.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember the emotions that I have with the thing that I'm doing more than I remember what I was doing.
Interesting. Okay, I think that's very opposite for me, or maybe not opposite, but very different for me. I like to talk about things with people, so I will ask a bunch of questions about the stuff I'm learning, and they might sound like loaded questions because it might sound like I know the answer. In which case, like hearing someone who does know the answer say yes, or someone who doesn't know the answer say, well, that makes sense to me, is really helpful. But other times I'll just have questions that I have no clue. Like I was doing some GraphQL stuff with that Go API that I was talking about,
Uh huh.
and I was using a library for the GraphQL layer, and I just could not figure out how to do what I wanted it to do. And I kept poking around at it and poking around at it, and it's a side project for me, so I don't have a ton of time to allocate to it. So I finally found a similar issue on GitHub, um, and said, "I've tried everything that you guys have suggested. I can't seem to get this to work. Here's what I'm trying to do." And some random person from GitHub commented on it and was like, "Hey, here's what I recommend you try instead. Do this, this, this." Like, and it really helped because it made me realize that instead of me just like throwing more spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks, I realized that I was looking at the problem the wrong way.
I see. Yeah, yeah. I think there is value in hearing other people's opinion. I actually think that it's really from explaining yourself. I think that rubber ducky debugging, I'm sure.
Of course, I have a rubber ducky on my desk and one not too far from my office as well.
That's hilarious. I just use my dog. I just talk to him, He's got pretty good advice.
My
But
dog Luna likes to bark back whenever I talk to her, so it's a little distracting.
that's hilarious. But yeah, rubber ducky debugging is a perfect example of how this whole concept works. How simple it is to just talk about it. It's almost like your brain doesn't figure out, or it's too lazy to figure out the details until you have to process it in speech to get it out to actually refine the details. And I feel like that's really how rubber ducky debugging works. And I think that's so valuable whenever you're talking to other people. You've mentioned talking to other people, and I would say that where talking to other people really brings a lot of value is what you're talking about with thinking about the problems differently, like perspectives. If I talk to you about something, the way you remember it, the way you interpret it, the way you describe it may even add a sort of sideways perspective to the way I think about it, the way I describe it, to improve my understanding of what that actually is.
Yeah, that's I totally agree with that. I'm in a really weird spot as well on a different vein where like I'm fortunate enough to be able to mentor a couple engineers, software engineers,
Uh-huh.
and they come to me with questions every now and then, which is great. I love that.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to figure out how to not just feed them the answer,
Yeah.
but to give them an answer that makes them like think but doesn't sound condescending. Does
Yeah.
that make sense?
Yeah. So hard.
Cool. Okay, I'm glad I'm not the only one that feels that way.
If you give them the answer, this is management stuff too. Like just in general, management is the same way. If you give them the answer, if you tell them micromanage, if you tell them what to do, they don't learn. They will never do it that way ever again. If you don't tell them what to do and you instead are able to let them figure it out, but be a guide, that's the hard part. And I really am not good at this, and I really have a hard time even comprehending how to go about forming those questions or forming those statements that I need to say. But it's absolutely way more important. You're really not giving them anything if you tell them the answer. But if you give them a way to find the answer, or I don't know, I guess that's it. Give them a way to find the answer. What do you think?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think actually I might have just asked you a question indirectly and you answered it fairly directly, which was really cool. But I think maybe talking to them and just explaining like it's I'm not going to give you an answer.
Yeah.
So if you ask a yes or no question, unless like production is broken or like someone's life is on the line,
Right.
like the question you should be asking is like, how do I figure this out, or why does this work this way? Not so much of like, well, what do I type here, or like, what should I use instead?
Right. So what's a problem that you were asked recently? Maybe we can like talk through because I kind of want to now.
Yeah, sure. So a really good example for anyone who doesn't know, I do TypeScript stuff quite a lot. So we had a question about interfaces in TypeScript. And what was really interesting is the developer that I was talking to has no real experience with typed languages. So They built really um,
One-off
really,
interfaces?
yeah, really one-off interfaces. And what really got interesting was like we're working on a project together, and they had some data coming back from an API, and that API gave way more data than they needed for their React component.
Mhm.
So we were talking about like how your React component's props interface should only be the props that it needs. It doesn't need like a full object if it only uses two keys from it.
Okay.
Um, and I felt pretty confident explaining that. And then I made the connection that maybe they don't know what an interface is because they have never used a typed language.
Right.
And then I got stuck, and I was like, how do I teach this? Like, how do I explain this in a way where like I can talk about, I guess, in a way, like a computer science topic, without sounding condescending or like uh, out of place.
I see. Yeah, I think interfaces, the real usefulness of interfaces really doesn't click until you see it from either a different perspective or work at like a major company. I remember back in the day, I used to not think there was a big difference between interface and class, especially when I was working in Java. I mean, I knew there was a difference. I didn't know what the difference was, and I didn't know what they were used for. But one thing that really solidified my understanding of interfaces was using Golang and their duck typing. Because duck typing, for anybody that doesn't know, is if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, then it must be a duck. And what that means is it simply is if if an object or a class matches the attributes and the functions that are defined in an interface, then there's no reason why that class shouldn't be considered one of that interface. So you can simply cast it to that interface without having to declare it ever. It's called implicit typing. Is that right?
Yeah, and Golang, I think they refer to it as implicit interfaces or
Implicit
implicit
interface.
interface implementation or something.
And that was really interesting to me because it really helped me understand that, oh, interfaces are kind of like a contract that says this is what you should expect coming through, but it can be implemented any number of ways.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. And what's really interesting about interfaces is it basically says like you can give me whatever you want, but these are the things I care about. So these
Right.
are the things that like if you change this stuff, you might break our agreement.
So the person you were talking to, did you talk to them about interfaces?
I did, yeah, a little bit, and tried to explain it, and it seemed like he grasped it pretty quickly, but it just felt like a weird conversation to have instead of just being like, "Well, here's what you do,"
Uh-huh.
and actually having to dig in and be like, "Well, here's why that works."
Right, I see. Wonder what a question like, how would you use this if you were to use this component elsewhere in your project would work? Because I feel like if you're talking about props and making it restricted to only the props it absolutely needs and really thinking about it in a black box component type mindset, that portability defines how you structure its inputs.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that not just the person that I've mentioned, but myself and even a lot of other developers kind of struggle with is figuring out like I could just pass it this entire object and it'll work fine and it's great because it's nice and easy, but if I want to reuse that in other parts of my code, now do I have to like make that object before using that component again to pass it into it?
Right.
And that gets really weird. So like a really good example is maybe you just need the ID of something, but you take in like I'm working on an app that works around books.
Okay.
So maybe I just need the book ID, but if I tell you I need an entire book object and you want to reuse that component,
Yeah.
two things will happen. You'll either give me an entire book object that you'll have to make right before you pass it into my component, or you'll give me an empty book object with an ID because you will have looked at my component and said, "Oh, they just use the ID," which like
Yeah.
maybe that's fine, but if
Yeah.
I'm using the book, maybe I also want the title and it's just not there yet, or maybe I don't really want that. So like I guess just being more specific with the props is really important.
Yeah, it's hard. That's a you mentioned struggling with it today. I don't think that problem ever stops. Like, I think the hardest problem that a developer faces is simply naming. variables. Like it's call me crazy, but naming variables is honestly one of the most important parts of development, in my opinion, and one of the hardest. What do you think about that?
Oh, I totally agree. As I've gotten older, and this is actually part of the reason why I don't really write much Clojure or F sharp anymore. I'm sure if anyone listening to this writes those languages, please call me out on it because I'm sure that's not the case. But it feels this way for me. I focus more on optimizing for readability
Hmm.
than I do for writability. And the one thing I liked about Clojure was I felt like I could knock out huge features in like 4 or 5 lines of code. Maybe a little more, but when I came back to that code, even me being the person that wrote it, like
Yeah,
weeks later, I'd be like, I have no idea what's going on here. So
yeah.
then I'd debug and refactor my own code. And if you ever find yourself debugging code that's not broken, like just to add a new feature, that is not a good sign.
That's a good rule of thumb right there. Somebody should write that down.
Yeah, that should be preserved. But that's exactly what I ran into, and I was like, "Man, so this is bad." Like, I'm in a situation where I was building an API, for podcasts actually, and I had a friend doing the front end for that, and it was written in Angular, and he just didn't know Clojure. I don't think he had any desire to learn Clojure, so we were trying to figure out the best way for him to be able to figure out what the endpoints expect and what they return without like me just literally writing all of them down. So we tried Swagger for a little bit. And we tried a couple other things, and we actually switched to Scala because he had some Java experience, and I really did not want to write Java. Uh, so we switched to Scala, and he's like, "I can read this stuff. This is pretty readable." And I ever since then, that moment has been like very motivational to focus on readability,
Uh-huh.
especially on anything that's not a personal project or anything that could ever grow beyond a personal project.
Absolutely. I think that that's absolutely on point. It takes a long time to learn too because we all love clever stuff, like the nested ternary operators. You've done there, I've done it, everyone's done it, and just random stuff that is super hard. And I'm sure Clojure, I've never worked with something that's so clever. Such a clever language, and but there was something that Yelp that they told us, and we were interns, so it was perfect advice for all of us. And they told us that you're working on a team. The person next to you has to be able to read it, just like you're saying. And you're building a web app. It's not like you're going to loop over a million records. You don't need to be super concise and efficient for the sake of efficiency, because these are people that could definitely write some very efficient code. But if you're going to loop over 100 records and you need to make 2 for loops, then do it. It's like if you're sacrificing readability, especially with working with other people, but even working yourself, in my opinion. Because here's the truth: you're going to be maintaining any app you build that's in production for the rest of your life until someone else does. That's the truth, and I don't think anybody really realizes that, but that's the life of a developer. And that really stuck with me was because a company that was hiring 300 or so engineers, or that had 300 engineers on staff, that they cared more about the practicality. And that's really, I think, where my practical mindset comes from, is working in a company. And Carfax is a great example of this too. It's just like I was at Carfax and we were both at Carfax, and we may or may not have liked some things about the way that things were done, but something that was repeated a lot was, this is the Carfax way. And being young myself, I didn't really understand exactly what that meant. But having more experience now, I really do get how you're you need to think about the things that you're doing with the context that you're given, not the ideal case scenario that you wish you had.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's something that it's like, especially when I was younger, and I'm probably still guilty of this today. Is like instead of focusing on the context, being like, "Well, that's not the way it should be. This is the way it should be."
Yeah.
But not everything is like roses and daisies.
It would be nice, but we're back to the moving too fast. I mean, I built an app right at the beginning of my development career, and I'm still maintaining it today, and it's a freaking nightmare. I'm being kicked off Heroku right now, so I have to move it over to EC2. So I'm Dockerizing it and all this stuff. But that just goes to show how fast it becomes relevant and even unsupported by hosting companies. So it's coming back to it. It's just it changes too fast. Like there's just no way to keep up with it.
Yeah. So I want to circle back a little bit to what you're talking about with Yelp. So two things that I feel are important to share um, are two ideas that I have recently tried to embrace as a developer. So the first one is every time you try to optimize code, you should consider if it's worth it. If you're working on software that runs pacemakers, it probably is.
Yeah.
Otherwise, consider it and say, is this going to make things easier to maintain going forward or harder to maintain? And
Yeah.
then what's the cost? Assuming, and this is a very outlandish assumption, assuming that a developer is paid $10 an hour to write code and considering the cost of upgrading a server slightly for an extra performance hit, it is way cheaper to write slightly less performant code that is more readable
Hmm.
than more performant code that is less readable. Just because the amount of time they will spend trying to wrap their head around what's going on,
Yeah.
even at $10 an hour, will quickly outnumber the cost of the extra server capacity.
Absolutely. People are getting more expensive every day. Servers are getting cheaper every day. I think that's only going to get more apparent.
Agreed. And the second thing that I feel like sharing is we've started. I always try to mention this in code reviews. Like when your code is on your machine, you're accountable for it.
Hmm.
When it gets merged into master, the team is accountable for it. So at that point, you have a code review where people on your team say, "Yes, I understand this. I'm okay with this being merged into master." That's the point. It's not to nitpick. It's not to like try to point out micro optimizations or assert like developer dominance.
Yeah.
It's saying, "I see what you've written. I accept that any of us might have to maintain this. I approve." And then when that goes to production, it's no longer the team that's accountable, it's the entire company.
Yeah. And that's it varies a little bit, you know. Definitely entire companies like wanting the site up and making sure that it works, and everybody's going to pitch in to make that sure that happens. But there's always like the people that originally wrote it, probably still maintaining a large portion of it. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the you're going to run into that kind of thing all the time.
Cool. I definitely agree with that, but I do want to give us another time to take a quick break, and then we'll come back and wrap all of this up.
Okay.
Does that work
So
for you?
yeah, sounds great.
Awesome. We'll be right back. And we're back. Shane,
Mhm.
so we talked about asking for help and what to do when you get stuck, but I have an interesting scenario, and I'm curious to hear your thought on it. So a friend and I picked up a couple Udemy courses the other day during their big sale, and we are planning to go through them together.
Okay.
So kind of we watch this like kind of like a book club. We'll both watch certain episodes or segments, and then every Thursday I go to a coffee shop, and that friend usually shows up as well, and we work on stuff. But I think the plan is to just kind of talk about what we've seen and digest it together.
Uh huh.
The first one's Go related, and he's pretty new to Go.
Okay.
But the next one is Flutter, and we're both new to Flutter. What are your thoughts on that?
What's Flutter?
Flutter is a oh lord, it's well, it's not a language. It's a toolkit for developing Android and iOS applications using the Dart programming language.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's I think it's a Google project. Now that you mention it,
That's really interesting. I Is Angular made by Google too? That was just something I was thinking about a minute ago.
uh, it originally was made by Google. I think it still is under their umbrella, although I know Microsoft has really stepped up and embraced a lot of it too.
Interesting. That's really interesting. I've not heard of Flutter. I've heard of Dart. I thought Dart was sort of something that was being phased out, but I didn't know. I mean, I don't know anything about it really. Dart's a sort of replacement to JavaScript, right?
It's Yeah, that and so much more.
Yeah.
It's really, really tricky. So it compiles down to JS,
Yeah.
and for a while there was an experimental Dart virtual machine that shipped with
Right.
Chrome that you could
Right.
turn on,
Yeah.
and
I
you could
remember that.
run Dart code instead of JavaScript code.
Right.
So
Okay.
they were very big about like ship your JS code and your Dart code, and Chrome will figure out which one it can run and run it for you. So you could have like enhanced features in Dart mode or stuff like that.
Yeah.
Um, and then they were like, oh yeah, by the way, you can write Dart on the server now too, and it kind of runs more like Java and than JavaScript. And it got really weird really fast, and then it kind of disappeared. I actually wrote a very not well received and very ill placed blog post a while back called "Dart is Dead" or like the death of Dart. So I was really shocked to
Who
hear when they announced Flutter and they're like, "We're using Dart for this." I'm curious how long that'll last, and I expect Kotlin might take over, but we'll see.
who was giving you crap about your Dart post? Twitter?
I no, I'm pretty sure someone posted it on Hacker News a while back, and it just
I
had
see.
really negative feedback. But I mean, Hacker News is kind of a negative place, so
Yeah,
what do you expect?
honestly, it's the devil's advocate if I've ever seen one.
Have you heard of dev.to?
Mm-mm.
So I've really taken a liking to that community over Hacker News. It's kind of different. It's a little more tech focused, less startup
Yeah.
focused, but really, really positive, great community.
I think that it more dev focused would be an awesome environment. I get not as much dev out of Hacker News anymore. I just kind of look at it for just generally academia type stuff. Like they're always coming out with like the history of the lockpicks or something, or like something interesting that I want to read rather than and keeping up on the random libraries that get posted. But more often than not, I feel like these days it's a lot more of just general news and interesting topics than it is like back in the day when I was first coming to Hacker News. It was like every day was a show Hacker News post, and every day was a new library for JavaScript. Like it literally seemed like that, and every day, just something more related to what you're talking about here, like dev.to.
Yeah, I definitely agree. We'll circle back to our question in just a second, but I'll explain why kind of I don't want to say switched because I still go to Hacker News every now and then, just way less.
Yeah.
So I started doing instead of New Year's resolutions, I do like a yearly theme,
Okay.
and this year's theme was positivity.
Nice.
So like removing negativity and focusing on positivity, and and that was one of the biggest negative sources that I had when I like wrote everything down and evaluated them. So
Dude,
uh,
you're same. I've cut Hacker News out of my life so many times because of how negative they are.
yeah, every now and then someone will post one of my blog posts on there, and I'll see like a flood of traffic and get really excited. And then I'll go to Hacker News, and like every now and then you'll find someone that like says something nice, but generally it's like, I don't know if I agree with this person because they share different values than me, so I'm gonna objectively state how they're wrong, and
Right.
like even though it's not.
So
But
I'm
it's
just reflecting.
interesting. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
He's just reflecting, or she is just reflecting on the blog post. You know what I mean? Reflecting themselves. Uh,
Yeah, it's
anything else?
really interesting because occasionally, like less frequently, in fact, I'll have posts shared to like Reddit or a couple other things, and those are all generally like I don't want to say positive, but they're very constructive.
Hmm.
People are asking like very valid questions, and they're not just complaining. Like Hacker News has become like the Facebook of of like tech news. It's kind of weird.
Even so, I feel like there's still so much value there. I it's crazy because I can't think of another source of quote unquote news that I like better than Hacker News. Like doesn't matter what Harvard Business Review maybe. Um that's it. I honestly can't think of and even they have some really clickbaity titles. But even Reddit, don't like Reddit that much. I feel like Reddit doesn't have a negative attitude, but they have a self-defeated attitude in a lot of cases.
That's fair. I can see that. I know there was a tutorial a while back posted by someone, and it was you know how like making a Hacker News clone has become the new like make a to do list for web
Yeah.
development. It was like idea for a tutorial: make a Hacker News clone where the people are nice.
That's hilarious.
So I do want to circle back. So we were talking about the book club type study buddy session. I was curious
Oh,
what your
yeah.
thoughts are on that.
I like the book club type study session. I think that I think everybody has a way they like to learn. Courses are not really my way I like to learn, but for people that do like to learn from courses, that'd be the way. My way to learn is more from like reading books, especially if it's a topic unrelated to coding. But if it's related to coding, like I have 3 data science books sitting in front of me right now. Um, but I definitely think that there's so much value in people. Like it, if you're coding in, especially if you don't have much experience, if you're sitting in your room and only coding and not talking to anybody else that's either a peer, knows less than you, or knows a little bit more than you, or knows way more than you, if you're not talking to somebody else, you're going to be learning substantially slower than going and just simply having chats with somebody once a week, like you're talking about.
Yeah, that's definitely the way I learn best. And I guess that brings up a really interesting point. Like if you are listening and you're new to development, and especially if you're in a big city, you should try to find a meetup. I guarantee there's a dev meetup where you can just kind of at least try to soak up the culture and the knowledge. And if you hate it, don't go back. You
Mhm.
maybe lose a Thursday evening or something. But I know when I lived in San Francisco, I loved going to meetups, and we have a couple where I'm at now, around the Louisville, Kentucky area, and those are still great. If you don't live in an area where there are meetups, consider hosting one.
Yeah,
Um, you don't have to be the most knowledgeable person on a topic to host, and if you can't do that, I highly recommend looking for an alternative, like an online type scenario where you can just like a user group where you can just talk about the tech that you're using with other people.
I agree. I think that in person's great. I think that you can just as much have something remote, especially with today and how easy it is to communicate. The way I actually learned, interesting, we're talking about this. I was learning to code in my own, just like what I was describing, in my basement. No one else to talk to. No one even know I programmed because I was embarrassed to tell anybody, hilariously. And one day my dad tells me that I need to find a partner if I'm ever going to start a business. So I end up thinking about the people that I knew from school, which I didn't know them, I just knew of them. And I knew that one person in one of my classes was learning how to code at the same time that I was writing papers about neuroscience and learning how to code in secrecy. And that person, I didn't know them at all. I never once talked to them, not even in that class, probably. And didn't know them at all in high school. And then as soon as I got out, about 6 months or so later, I messaged them on Facebook Messenger, like, "Yo, I heard you were into coding," because we were in the same class, and I, saw you talking about it. And it turned out that he was like, really active, really crushing it, really wanting to do a lot of things in his free time, and I was wanting to do the same. We both wanted to start startup. Just ambitious. We're reading Hacker News every day. We're just getting hype. And what we did was we started a chat on Hangouts, Google Hangouts, and we simply sent links to each other every day. Like we'd be sitting there on Hacker News, be like, "Yo, you check out this new library? Look at this book I just read," or "What do you think of this piece of code?" or "Look at this funny picture," or Microsoft just like anything that possibly could be shared. And I've not stopped doing that to this day with that person. His name's Ryan, but you probably hear him at some point on this show, actually. But hopefully, he got some good stuff to say, I'm sure.
Yeah, we'll see. I'm looking for more guests, so if he's interested, I'd love to hear from him.
All right, I'll put a good word in. I think he'll be down. And but yeah, that was so important. And here's the interesting thing: Ryan and I have always been in the group since day one, but other people have come and gone, and they've come and gone to do different things. So, for instance, there's a guy named Drew that was added to the group at some point, and more or less by osmosis, really got into the same vibe, got into the same wavelength. And he's seen a lot of success too, and he's a very good dev now too. And there was another person named Man, I'm blanking right off the top of my head. And I feel so bad that I'm blanking, but Zoo, that was his name, DZU. And his name was Zoo, and he never really participate, but I could tell he randomly would come on and read, and now he's crushing it, doing something awesome at Walmart. Even if you didn't participate in this group, but you were part of the group, the amount of information that was exchanged and just the pure like it was like almost like leading by example, and it really got people hooked. And I thought that was really interesting, and I've never really had another time where it's replicated something so efficiently, but that I think that honestly, that chat might be the reason why I made it through it all.
Yeah, I having a support system is so important,
Yeah,
and we do that as well with some of my friends. We have a Discord channel where we post. It's called One Up actually, and it's a bunch of different stuff. There's a programming topic, there's a game design topic, art studio, um, stocks, all sorts of silly stuff. But yeah, we post stuff like that, and we also have like there's a Facebook group with most of my programmer, developer, software engineer friends that sees a lot less traffic than it used to. But that was a thing for a while. Like you're definitely not the only one that has done that, and we've seen a lot of success from it too.
definitely. It's just so important to share ideas. It's like having 10 people learning at the same time has so many more feelers out for good ideas than one person that's just looking for one idea, you know what I mean?
Completely agree. It's the think tank idea
Yeah.
or concept.
Yeah. And it provides such a good network effect too, because here's the truth. The people that get hired at most companies are referrals. That's it. Like, you can go through the system and you better be able to sell yourself, or not in like an overly way, but just like be able to talk about things, reason through problems, like answer the team politics type problems well, like what do you do when a problem arises and stuff like that, and also show some coding skills. But I feel like that your best bet of getting a job anywhere is if somebody internally recommends you, because you're going to instantly get a interview, no questions asked, and you're likely going to get some form of expedited process, barring even big companies, but even big companies do it. And the truth is that they want to hire referrals because referrals are going to be the most tried and true candidates.
They're also generally a lot cheaper too, especially if the company pays like a headhunter or
True.
like a recruiting firm to staff them. Um,
Absolutely.
Referrals are super cheap for them, even if they give you a referral bonus. So like it's really a win-win because ideally you get to work with great people that you've worked with in the past or you know are going to be good workers, and you get a little bit of money out of it.
As an interesting anecdote to this whole statement and how real it is and how much it was obvious to me, when I worked at Sumo, a startup here in Austin, I was the only inbound hire that they ever hired. They had never hired anybody that wasn't either referral or Noah looking for them specifically and poaching them essentially. And I was employee number 30 or something.
Damn, that is
They didn't hire anybody else after either from through their channels. I
that's
was the only one.
crazy.
I know, and that's how much, like, especially at companies like small, quote unquote small businesses making millions of dollars a year, but quote unquote small businesses, uh, people with 50 or less people, even Carfax. I mean, they're going to do a lot of referrals too.
Yeah, I was a referral at Carfax and a referral from my current employer as well, Team Snap. Like, and that just worked out really well.
Yeah, it's so important, and all you have to do is make friends with the people that are also doing the same thing as you. So it's pretty easy. you know and they go get jobs, you get jobs, and you help them out, you share ideas like links and have good times, and they help you out. Same thing happens.
Yeah, I will say that it's not super easy. Um, just because like not only do you have to be a good person and make sure that they see that, but
Yeah,
also like you know your stuff. A lot of times when you refer
yeah,
someone, they could be placed on the same team as you. So if you're not really willing to work with that person, then maybe don't refer them.
yeah, definitely not just refer whoever, because a referral is definitely a statement of the person referring. Like it's not like you are giving them every possible person. It's like asking that person. It's kind of a statement of your reputation.
Yeah, it really is. And like, if I were to refer someone and they come in and bomb it, and I'm the whole time in the interview process, maybe the panel that is interviewing is like, I don't really know, I'm kind of on the fence, but Brad said he's a real rock star
Yeah.
or something, and they come in and bomb it, like, well, there goes my credibility. I'm not going to be able to get anyone else referred.
Right, or if you are, it's gonna be at least thought through again, you know? Maybe they won't play it too hard on you, but still, it's gotta be something considered.
So generally, when we try to wrap things up, I ask the question of what are you going to work on next, or what's next for the project that we're talking about. But we talked a lot about learning, so I'm curious, what are you planning on learning next?
Hmm. So, I have, like, 10 books in front of me, so that'd probably be a good place to start. Let's see, data science was one of them, and I started getting into it, and I learned that 80% of my time is gonna be spent wrangling data into a usable format and it's okay, but it's not really something that I enjoy that much. So I likely won't pursue that path for a job or like a skill that I'm going to do for a job. But do really enjoy the knowledge for building a business or seeing, having that tool to use when I see a problem that needs that tool rather than trying to apply a hammer to everything. So there's that. Um, After I decided that I didn't really want to pursue that as a consultant or contractor, I'm going to instead go back to my bread and butter and do React. And there's not a ton of learning that has to be done because I did React for almost a year at Sumo. So I have a lot of knowledge about how to do it. And I led that project. So I very much understand it, but I don't remember it completely. So what I'm going to end up doing is starting a project that needs, like, it could be something simple, like I don't know what the project's going to be yet, but it could be, any number of things and just anything. And it's going to simply use React and I'm going to build the tools. I'm going to set up an environment that I like. I'm going to use Docker. I don't even know what I'm going to use for build tools. Can you believe that? I know I'm going to use TypeScript because I know TypeScript is awesome, but I don't know if I can just. So my build is makefile, Dockerfile, and that's all that I do. I don't do any of the other stuff. So, or I try not to. So if I can't build it with one line from the command line from TypeScript, I'm gonna be vastly disappointed because I have to go back to the React app and work with the Create React app, which is a nightmare, in my opinion.
That's interesting. I know most people really love Create React App. If you
Really?
start,
The build tools, like what are you supposed to do with the build tools? When you export them, they're unusable.
you mean eject?
Eject,
Yeah.
yeah, but like
Oh,
same difference.
yeah, yeah. Sorry, I was just making sure we were talking about the same thing.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to sound snooty.
No, no worries. I don't know. They're not that bad. I mean, it's Webpack, so it's kind of hard to read just in general. But
That I guess that may be my problem is I'm just not super good at Webpack. I'm super familiar, but my gosh, like another problem is they're trying to do so much modularization. Like you need to compile only one tiny little piece of a React app. It's a React app. Until I have like 1,000 components, I really don't need to care about breaking up my build.
yeah, it's interesting. That kind of circles all the way back to our like, don't worry, don't optimize so much. Focus on readability,
Yeah,
or like maintainability of the build pipeline. In this case, it's not easy because it's optimized for everyone, I guess.
yeah. It's optimized to use at a big company that needs a big system,
Yeah.
but it's not optimized to come in, tweak for your purposes so that you can put a React app out in a weekend.
When you use Create React App, you can dash dash TypeScript and have TypeScript support.
Okay. I'll look into that because I definitely so does TypeScript have a one command that you can build everything with?
Yeah, So you have like a TypeScript config.json, and then
Okay.
TSC, the TypeScript compiler, will read your TS config. But yeah, if you do create React app dash dash TypeScript and then you eject, like you'll even if you don't eject, your npm like run start will start your app for you and with TypeScript compilation and everything. Like it's all wired up. And then npm run build, I think, will give you your prod build.
So no more Webpack.
Well, you still will likely use Webpack. Create React app ships with Webpack. So even if you do the TypeScript one, you still will have Webpack. And I think it uses like awesome TypeScript loader under the hood.
What does Webpack bring to the table that is important in the situation?
Oh man. So that's a whole nother episode. But I'll talk lightly on it. So
Okay.
the idea is basically it's one build system regardless of whatever front end thing you're doing. So whether you're writing TypeScript or JavaScript or HTML or CSS, it all kind of bundles everything and treats it like one cohesive piece. So
I
you
see.
can import CSS into your TypeScript, for example, or you can import an image into your JavaScript, and
Hmm.
that'll give you it'll give you a hashed image ID in that case for each build, and then you can just reference that. And instead of having to worry about like, well, the path is actually public slash images slash my image.png. You just import my image.png in your code, and Webpack will take care of all of that for you.
I
It's
see.
it's really nice once you uh, understand what it does. But yeah, modifying it, man, can be a total pain, especially if you're new.
Yeah. I I yeah. I don't know. Not, this it just goes back to the thing is it seems to me like it's not for what I'm doing.
Yeah, that's fair, and it might not be, and it definitely can feel that way. Uh,
I yeah. Anyway, go ahead.
I was just gonna ask, as we kind of wrap things up, if people are interested in following you or your work, where can they do that? Do you have a GitHub or a Twitter handle or personal website or
So
anything?
I do. I have all of those, and Shane Burkhart. I try to make my username just my name, and my Twitter handle is Shane underscore underscore Burkhart, and my GitHub is just Shane Burkhart camel cased, Pascal case, not camel cased. Not that it matters. And what was the last one? Oh, personal website, shaneburkhart.com.
Nice, you got the good TLD.
Yeah. There's only other one Shane Burkhart in the world that ranks on my Google search, so got my work cut out.
Yeah, there are a couple of Brad Seiperts, but I'm doing pretty well, so I can't complain.
Yeah.
Well, I guess that wraps it up for this episode of the Design Doc podcast. As always, I'm your host, Brad Seipert. You can find me on Twitter at BradCypert. Same with GitHub. And my personal website and mailing list, if you're interested, is bradseipert.com. You can find Design Doc anywhere podcasts can be heard. Thanks for tuning in.